Good evening. Good evening from Sydney, Australia, and welcome. Welcome to the September 2021 online meeting of Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. My name is Richard Saunders from the Australian Skeptic and the producer and host, one of the hosts of the Skeptic Zone podcast. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting tonight. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, don't forget, you can subscribe to our magazine, The Skeptic, this year celebrating 40 years of publication. In fact, you can access most back issues of the magazine, going back almost 40 years, free at www.skeptics.com.au. Now, what do UFO proponents and believers in homeopathy have in common? Find out when you buy the next issue of the Skeptic magazine. And put Thursday the 7th of October in your diary for the next Skeptics in the Pub online. And keep an eye out for details at our meetup page. And you can find that by going to Meetup and searching for AUST Skeptics, Ost Skeptics. This year, the Australian and New Zealand Skeptics are holding a joint convention. That is on the 20th and the 21st of November. You can register your interest at www.skepticon.org.au or just head to australianskeptics.com.au for more details. We will be bringing you news of our speakers very soon now. Of course, something of the convention may be influenced by COVID here in Sydney and in Wellington. We're not sure. We're working to see what we can do about this situation, but don't worry. Whatever happens, there'll still be a convention and it'll still be online. We're busy trying to get our ducks in a row, as you can imagine. And speaking of conventions, I have been asked to appear virtually at Skeptrack at DragonCon in Atlanta, Georgia, this coming Saturday, 9 a.m. Sydney time. I'll be talking about ghosts. Oh, an old favorite of the Skeptics. And you can check out the entire weekend's events at YouTube by looking for Skeptics Track. One word, Skeptics Track, and you should be able to check out the DragonCon convention in Atlanta, Georgia. Very wisely, the Skeptics Track is online this year. I'll also be talking about the Great Australian Psychic Prediction Project for the Bay Area Skeptics on the 10th of September at 12:30 p.m. Sydney time. For more details, check out Bay Area Skeptics, which is baskeptics.org. And a big shout out to all my friends in California and Oregon and all around the United States. But now to tonight's talk. Circular reasoning, the rise of the flat earth. In 2013, when Michael Marshall first interviewed the vice president of the Flat Earth Society for his show Be Reasonable, a great podcast, people could scarcely believe that anyone could genuinely think the earth was flat. 8 years later, flat earth belief has gone mainstream, sporting thousands of hours of YouTube videos. I've seen some of them, gaining widespread international media coverage and attracting countless followers. So how on earth, okay, did we get here? By walking on the flat earth, I guess. In this talk, Michael will talk through his experiences of the flat earth movement, taking a look at the leaders and some of their reasoning, and report back from the weekend he spent at the UK's first ever flat earth convention. We used to joke here. I seem to remember there was a joke that you could join the Flat Earth Society in Sydney, and it was basically an excuse to drink, I think. Michael Marshall is the project director of the Good Thinking Society, editor of the UK online publication The Skeptic, not to be confused with our publication The Skeptic, and president of the Merseyside Skeptics Society. He regularly speaks with proponents of pseudoscience for the Be Reasonable podcast, and that is really worth a listen. Be Reasonable. I can highly recommend that podcast. I never miss an episode. His work has seen him organizing international homeopathy protests. I remember taking part in one many years ago, the 1023 protest, going undercover to expose Psychics and Quackmedics, and co-founding the popular QED conference. He has written for The Guardian, The Times, and The New Statesman. Now, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of our guest, and you can do that via the link that you should see on the Twitch page at the moment. That will take you to a Slido page. That's where you type in your questions. Feel free to chat on the Twitch page and say hello and whatever you want to do. But if you really want to ask questions of our guest tonight, please use Slido, and that's what I can access here on my magnificent other screen. And if you haven't already done so, please check the follow button here at Twitch, and you'll be notified whenever the Australian Skeptics go live. But for now, while I grab my drink, Skeptics in the Pub, please join me in welcoming our guest tonight, Michael Marshall.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Richard. I'm afraid I'm not going to be joining you in an alcoholic beverage because it's 10 in the morning here, and as bad as the pandemic's got, it's not driven me quite to that point just yet. But it's a pleasure to be speaking, albeit virtually, for an Australian audience. I've always had a great time whenever I've been to Australia, whenever I've spoken to Australian skeptics. And I'm going to be talking now about something I spent quite a while looking into, really, and something I developed quite a deep interest in, and that is this belief in the flat Earth, which sort of a lot of people, when they first saw it in the newspapers, kind of got the impression it came from nowhere, that it sort of exploded out of nowhere. But I've been watching that movement for some time, and I want to tell you all about my experiences of it. So, I mean, Richard's introduced me absolutely perfectly there about the various different things that I do. So I'm a full-time skeptical investigator for the Good Thinking Society. I'm an editor of The Skeptic here in the UK. And I do have this podcast called Be Reasonable, where I talk to people that I disagree with. And I try to, rather than have an argument and rather than try to tell them how wrong they are, I try to understand what brings them to their perspective, their outside of the mainstream view, and how they support that, and trying to have a productive dialogue to see if we can learn as much as possible about why people believe unusual things. And it's actually really from the Be Reasonable podcast, rather than my other work, that the flat Earth interest and my understanding of the flat Earth really started to grow. Because a lot of people will have seen, I imagine, the various ways in which, in the last couple of years, the flat Earth movement has broken through to the mainstream. So you may have seen you may have seen articles about it in the mainstream news. You may have seen a documentary on Netflix called Behind the Curve, which I'll come back to in a little bit during this talk. You may even have seen posters like or billboards, advertisements like the one you see at the bottom of the screen there. Research flat Earth. You may have seen, as I have, stickers on lampposts or graffiti saying "Research flat Earth." And to really understand how this bloomed and blossomed in about sort of 2016, 2017, we have to kind of go back and look at the history of the flat Earth movement very briefly. So really where the modern version of the flat Earth movement begins is in 1838 with this guy called Samuel Rowbotham. And Rowbotham's an evangelical Christian who believes that the world is only 6,000 years old, that these newfangled theories of evolution are completely false. And in order to demonstrate that the Bible is true and all this Darwin stuff is nonsense, he starts looking for physical proofs of the flat Earth. Reasoning that if he can prove the world is flat and then point to parts of the Bible that agree with the world being flat, he can say that the Bible's true. And one of the things he does, he conducts this experiment on the Bedford Level Canal, where he stands on the canal bank and has his friend row away for him in a boat. And by looking at curvature calculations, he calculates that once his friend passes 5 miles of distance between them, his friend ought to be behind the curve. He ought to have disappeared over the horizon. So as he conducts this experiment, his friend gets past 5 miles, gets to 6 miles, and through his telescope, he can still see his friend. And from this, he surmises that the world has to be flat because he can think of no other explanation as to why you'd be able to see someone who is so far away that there ought to be an entire curved Earth between them. What he was missing at the time, of course, were things that we know now, and I think a lot of people knew at the time, was the light actually refracts around the curved Earth. So even though there is a curvature in the way, the light bends due to various forces, especially over water where you have kind of condensation things to act as a lens, and that's why you can see further than the curve. But Rowbotham thought this was absolute proof of the biblical truth of the flat Earth, and he wrote about this in the 1830s, all the way through the 1830s and 40s. By the time we get to the 1870s, we have John Hampden, who's a follower of his, who makes a bet with Alfred Russel Wallace that he could repeat the experiment and demonstrate the same thing, that the world is flat. Now, Russel Wallace is a name that you might recognize. He was the silver medalist when it came to the theory of evolution. Darwin got there just before him. So again, even in this second experiment, this bet, it's tied into the argument between creationists and the emergent theories of evolution and our scientific understanding of the world. And Hampden repeats this experiment, and they're able to demonstrate actually that it's not proof that the world is flat. But that doesn't deter followers of Rowbotham, especially when he publishes this book, this pamphlet in 1881, which is a highly, highly influential book under the pen name Parallax, called Zetetic Astronomy, Earth is Not a Globe. And this is his collection of all of his different physical proofs with diagrams that the world is flat. And he tries to demonstrate as many different ways as he can. And many of the demonstrations actually used by Rowbotham under the pen name Parallax in this pamphlet continue to be the ones that resurface even in the last sort of 5-10 years. Many of the most influential flat Earth materials of the last decade, the last 20 years, actually use direct images from Parallax's original work here. So it's hugely influential. And when Rowbotham dies, a local aristocrat here in the UK picks up his work and decides to found the Universal Skeptics Society, which is a forerunner to the Flat Earth Society. And it's a group that just exists to spread this pamphlet and the gospel of Flat Earth, almost literally the gospel of Flat Earth, as widely as possible. And it gains thousands of members up until the turn of the 20th century and the early 20th century, when the membership starts to dwindle. And I would argue part of the reason the membership started to dwindle around that time is there were more and more experiments of people getting higher off the ground in early aeroplanes and things like that. And the higher up you get, the more likely you are to recognize that there is a very subtle, to the naked eye, curvature of the Earth. So the higher up we get and the more photos and various other evidence points up we get, and the more people leave the Flat Earth movement in the early 20th century. And then the Flat Earth Society comes in 1956, founded by a guy called Samuel Shenton, who again was an evangelical creationist Christian, picking up on Rowbotham's arguments to demonstrate that the Bible is true. He founded the Flat Earth Society in 56. When he died in 71, the whole movement got moved over to America by a guy called Charles K. Johnson, who wrapped it up with his evangelical church and called it the Flat Earth Research Society of America. There was actually a moment in the 90s where the whole movement was put at risk by a house fire in Charles K. Johnson's house, where many of the books in which contained the names and addresses of members of the Flat Earth Research Society of America burned in that fire, and he had no backups. And so the entire society was almost entirely lost and dwindled down to a very small membership up until around 2004, when the Flat Earth Society was refounded as an online forum, primarily an online group and forum for people to discuss the flat Earth. It was reformed and founded by a guy called Daniel Shenton, who, and this blows my mind, is no relation of Samuel Shenton's. I find that more astonishing than perhaps I ought to, but I've only ever heard of two people called Shenton in all of recorded history. They're both flat earthers and they're unrelated. And that alone to me is mind-boggling, but perhaps not the most mind-boggling aspect of this entire tale. And then in 2013 is when I first really got to grips with the Flat Earth movement and the Flat Earth Society, when I interviewed the vice president of the Flat Earth Society, a chap called Michael Wilmore, who I interviewed actually on the second episode of Be Reasonable in January 2013. And talking to Michael Wilmore, I found out some really interesting things about the Flat Earth belief. So, for example, I found out that there were schisms in the belief between different models of the world. There were some who believed the world was a disk with the Arctic Circle in the middle, much as you see in the logos on screen there. And then there were others who thought, well, it's not a disk with a hard wall of edge around the edge, because yes, there is the Arctic Circle in the middle and the countries of the world splayed out, and yes, there's ice beyond that. But rather than being a finite edge to round out the disk, the ice at the edge of the world just goes on forever, and that the Earth is an infinite plane in all directions that bisects reality. And this was quite a vociferous schism in the movement between people who had these different ideas of different models. So that's one of the schisms that I learned about. But the other schism that I learned about, I think, is equally interesting and perhaps even more important, is that this movement was, I would argue, split between people who absolutely fundamentally believed that the world was flat and people on the other hand who knew for a fact it wasn't, but they just enjoyed the intellectual pursuit of arguing from a position they knew to be false, to see how esoteric and off the wall and interesting and bizarre they could come up with in terms of proofs to demonstrate a position they knew was not true. And so you'd get quite educated people who really did understand the physics of the world coming up with unusual ways to demonstrate this absurd position. But the problem was these intellectual trolls were really good at what they did, and they really convinced the other people who did believe that the world was flat to believe it even more. So we had this kind of spiraling effect of people who didn't really believe what they were saying, who were arguing in bad faith, but they were persuading people who really did believe it. And because this was a forum where lots of conversations and arguments were taking place, a lot of skeptics would see these conversations and would rush in to correct the stupid flat earthers, thinking, I know better than all of them. I'm a skeptic. I know the world is round. I've never thought about it before, but I'm right. And therefore I must be able to demonstrate to them how completely wrong they are. And people would go wading into these arguments, assuming that they could correct all these stupid people. And they'd lose the arguments because what the skeptics weren't really taking into account a lot of the time was the people who argue that the world is flat spend a lot of their time arguing that the world is flat. So you can't really necessarily easily come in casually, having done none of the research, and expect to win those arguments. A lot of people coming in saying, well, I'm going to argue with the first piece of information I can think of that I think proves the world is flat. Not reasoning that if it's the first piece of information you can think of, it's probably the first piece of information they thought of, and they're still flat earthers. So they must have an answer to that. They must have a way of reasoning back against that. Even if it's a faulty way, they must have something in there that they can use to hold off that piece of information. So because people who wanted to disagree with flat earthers weren't doing the research into the pseudoscience, they might have known the science, but they didn't know the pseudoscience arguments. They were wading into conversations that they were kind of out of their depth for, and they were losing those arguments, largely losing the arguments to the intellectual trolls who knew full well what they were saying was nonsense, but could just find ways of piecing their way through the arguments that were being made. And in doing so, they were causing even more people to believe that the world was flat. Because they were seeing the skeptics lose the arguments. And so we were seeing these kind of schisms play out, schisms in terms of the different models of the world, schisms in terms of how the physics of the real world worked. And so skeptics were coming in and saying things like, look, if the world is a disk with whatever height the disk is, it's not a globe with a spherical mass, or if it's an infinite plane in all directions that bisects reality, either way, you're going to struggle to explain gravity. Because in the conventional model of gravity that we understand, you need the spherical mass with a center of mass that causes an attractive force towards the center of the ball. But when you have a flat plane, it's much harder to explain that. But they weren't accounting, these skeptics, for these people who did know the physics of the real world and were just mucking about, who'd say, well, hang on, what is gravity? Gravity is an accelerating force downwards, 9.8 meters per second squared. You drop something, it accelerates towards the ground. That, argue the intellectual trolls, is indistinguishable from a world in which you let go of something and the world rises up to meet it. Because, according to those people, the world is actually accelerating upwards at 9.8 meters per second squared, and that explains the effects that we feel of gravity. It's not that things fall, it's that things stay still, but everything else is accelerating upwards. And now we posit a world in which the Earth is an infinite plane in all directions that bisects reality and is accelerating upwards, and has been since the dawn of time. And the skeptics who would see that argument would say, haha, well, you're completely wrong there, because you're missing an obvious limitation, the speed of light. If you're accelerating for long enough, eventually you're going to overtake the speed of light, which isn't possible. It's the speed limit of the universe. Therefore, your arguments are completely wrong. But again, the people who'd really thought about this a lot had an answer to that. They'd say, well, look at Einstein's theory of relativity. It says that as you approach light speed, time begins to slow down. So yes, the world is accelerating, but the faster it gets, the slower time gets. And from our perception, everything works back out again. And therefore, we can have a world in which infinite acceleration is possible because time just gets slower and slower and slower until it's imperceptibly slow. But we can't tell because we're all working within that relative frame. And people were losing those arguments, and people were being persuaded to really double down on these flat Earth beliefs. But this was around about 2013, and the movement wasn't going viral at 2013. It didn't catch fire. It didn't have hundreds of thousands of believers all around the world or billboards saying research flat Earth. And I think part of the reason for that is that complexity of argument. that if you have to try and understand to some degree Einstein's theory of relativity in order to explain why gravity works in a flat Earth world, that's quite a complex argument to get your head around. You can't write all of that on a picture and make it go viral as a meme. It doesn't appeal to the gut level. It's a purely intellectual argument. So I think actually the intellectualism of some of the flat Earth arguments, the way that they were looking for specificity of detail, even if they were wrong about the conclusions they came to, was actually part of the thing I think that limited its spread, or certainly didn't add to its viral spread. But that all changed. Oh, sorry, before I tell you how it all changed, I want to show you different models of the world. So here's 3 different models of what the flat Earth might look like. On the left there, you can see the azimuthal equidistant model, the one that we all have in our heads when we think of flat Earth, the disk with the Arctic Circle in the middle. The middle one, there you can see that's Michael Wilmore, the Vice President's own favored model, which apparently allows for better explanation of how ships can travel around the world in certain times. And on the far right there, you can see one version of the infinite plane of ice model. And this version posits that because Earth is basically a puddle in the middle of all of the ice on which we live, then maybe if there's an infinity of ice, maybe there are other puddles. Maybe there's land in those puddles. Maybe there are creatures on that land, and that's where aliens come from. Instead of coming from a different world, they're just popping across from the next puddle. Now, I think this latter model is what happens when you have somebody who's already a conspiracy theorist who believes in alien visitation and the like, and then they come to be favored, come to favor the flat Earth model. And rather than find the dissonant points, the points where those two ideas clash, they just push them together to form a new narrative. And so now you have a world in which aliens are proof of the flat Earth because they're not coming from the planets, because the planets don't exist. They're just popping across from the next pond over, and there might be an infinity of ponds. And this is something we see a lot with the flat Earth movement and with conspiracy theories more general at the moment, is this accumulation of other conspiracies to it. It just pulls in more and more different conspiracy theories and knits them into this grand narrative. So now we have to believe in all manner of different things as well as the flat Earth. And this, I think, holds up. I don't think I've ever met a flat earther who only believes the world is flat. And I'll come back to that later in the talk. So things weren't going viral in 2013. That all changed in 2015 and 2016, and partly because of the publication of 2 highly influential YouTube series and ebooks. So this is Eric Dubay's 200 Proofs That the World is Not a Spinning Ball. And this is this is probably the most cited YouTube series and ebook in the modern flat Earth movement. So since Parallax is probably next up is Eric Dubay. And this is 3 years after I was having those conversations with the Flat Earth Society, where they're talking about Einstein's theory of relativity, incredibly complex arguments and infinite acceleration and the like. And they've had 3 years by this point to hone those arguments, to make them more robust, to sense check them. So one would imagine if this was a real science, the arguments of Eric Dubay's highly influential 200 Proofs would be comprehensive enough and complex enough to show progression from that point. But instead, what we get is gut level simplicity. We get the horizon looks flat and therefore it must be flat. You know, water can't flow uphill, water can't run downhill, water can't ever bend. If you fill a bathtub with water, eventually it'll settle, and it'll settle completely flat. It won't have curves and undulations to it. And that's because water, as they say, always finds its level. They argue that pilots, when they're flying around, flying from one place to the Earth on another, whenever they are at altitude, there's never a point at which they have to course correct to stop themselves flying off into space. So say if the world was flat and pilots are flying straight, they would eventually just fly straight off into space. But they argue to avoid that, you'd have to talk to a pilot and ask them whether there's any point in their journey where they have to keep correcting their course. And pilots will say that doesn't happen. Obviously, what that is, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the physics of the world that they're rejecting. It's not engaging with the real, true physics. They say cannonballs. If you fired a cannonball from north to south on a world that's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour to the west, or the east, I always get those two mixed up. But anyway, spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, what you would see from the ground, according to the flat earther, is the cannonball would leave the cannon and then fly off to one direction to the side at 1,000 miles an hour, because the cannon would be spinning at 1,000 miles an hour away from the cannonball, which would fly true. Obviously, that's not the physics of the real world, and I'll show you why later in the talk. They say, what about helicopters? If you really wanted to get somewhere in a helicopter on a world that's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, surely, they argue, all you'd need to do is just lift up and wait for the world to spin to see the bit that you want to come beneath you and then land again. But that isn't how helicopters work, they argue, and that's because they say the world is flat and helicopters have to travel. They say, what about an airplane that's traveling towards the spin of the Earth? Airplanes travel at like 400 miles an hour or whatever. If the Earth is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, what we should witness, they argue, is an airplane going backwards at 600 miles an hour as the world overtakes it. So again, complete failure to engage with the physics of the real world. They argue, if the world was spinning, we'd feel it. That's genuinely one of the arguments. It's just this gut level thinking, not taking into account that, for one, few of us have ever felt what it's like to not be spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, because very few of us ever get into space. And for two, misunderstanding the inertial effects of everything around you also spinning. So relative to the world around you, you're not moving at 1,000 miles an hour because we're all moving at the same speed, like being on a school bus in a closed system and throwing a paper airplane from the back of the bus to the front. You don't have to overcome the speed that the bus is traveling in order to make the airplane fly, because everything on that bus is also traveling at the same speed of the bus. So misunderstanding those physics. They say, if Australia was genuinely upside down, people would fall off. That is genuinely argument 113. Incredibly simplistic stuff. They say, the Bible says the earth is flat and moving, and therefore it is. Well, if the Bible says it, then it must be true. But again, going back to those evangelical creationist roots of the flat earth movement in the 19th century. And one of the arguments is Pythagoras, Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Neil Armstrong were all Freemasons, therefore flat earth. That's as far as the argument goes. It's just rumor mongering, but it's this illustration of how it's just accumulating conspiracy theories to it, even though there's no evidence that those people were all Freemasons. And if there were, there's no evidence that that would mean that the world was flat. But because you're rumor mongering and creating a tapestry of conspiracy, it allows for people who already believed in the Freemasons are in charge of the world conspiracy theory. It allows for them to come into the flat earth movement. And I think this is why this was such a successful and influential book, or a successful and influential YouTube video, because it has arguments here for whatever flavor of conspiracy theorist you are. If you're somebody who just believes in the evidence of your own senses and don't believe your senses can be fooled, then it's got arguments there saying the horizon's flat. If you're more like engineering minded or mathematically minded, it has mathematical proofs that have flaws in them, but enough to try and make you overlook those flaws. So it's got something to appeal to all sorts of different conspiracy theorists. And this is why this is hugely influential. The other hugely influential thing that happened around the same time was the publication of videos to YouTube by Mark Sargent, who, if you have seen the Behind the Curve documentary on Netflix, he's one of the main flat earthers in that documentary. And Mark Sargent describes himself as someone who was a conspiracy theorist who believed in all manner of different conspiracy theories. So he believed that the JFK assassination was an inside job from the US government. He believes the moon landing was fake, that there used to be a civilization on Mars who carved a face on Mars. And he said he first came across the flat earth movement in 2014 and spent 9 months trying to debunk it. And when he was unable to debunk it after 9 months of trying, he said he was left with no alternative but to accept that it must be true. Now, I would argue you do have another alternative, which is to accept that it isn't true, but you don't have the information to figure out why. But it goes back to this personal sense of, if I personally can't figure something out, it is unfigure-outable. There's no level of expertise beyond my current reach that could be more informed on this topic or could have a more informed insight into this topic. Your own powers of perception and powers of observation and powers of deduction are the highest form of proof in a lot of the flat earth world. And he produced these videos called Flat Earth Clues in 2015. And again, these are the ones that are most highly cited by the modern flat earther. And I actually interviewed him on Be Reasonable in January 2017. And because I'd had these experiences with the flat earth movement before, I thought the first thing I want to do is understand what model of flat earth does he believe in? Because there's no point me arguing about one model of flat earth if it's not the one in his head. And so he said, yes, he does believe that the earth is a disk, but instead of it being just a disk floating in space, he actually believes it's under a dome. He said it's like the film The Truman Show. And he actually said it's not a coincidence that's like the film The Truman Show, because he said the people who control Hollywood know that the world is under a dome. And so they put out The Truman Show as kind of controlled opposition to throw you off the scent, to discredit you if you think the world's under a dome. So if you said, did you know the world's beneath a dome? People could say, I think you're thinking of a film that was called The Truman Show made. Now, if you've heard the euphemism, the people who control Hollywood before, and the idea that they are privy to all sorts of secret knowledge about the world that they're obscuring, and you know what that's a euphemism for, then I promise you we will get to that euphemism and the implications for the Flat Earth movement later in this talk. According to Sargent, in the 1960s, you had the US and you had Russia vying in the Cold War, vying and posturing to see who could be the bigger superpower. And in doing so, they traveled all around the world looking for places of military strategic importance, of mineral wealth resources, things like that. And so they turned to Antarctica. And around about the same time in the 60s, while they're in Antarctica, they found the wall. And at that point, according to Mark Sargent, the Cold War finished. And everything after that was a phony war that they pretended to be adversaries because they were colluding to hide the bigger truth that the world is under a dome and that they found the edge. And he says there's even proof of this. There's proof in the shape of the gravestone of Werner von Braun, so the rocket scientist who was smuggled out of Nazi Germany after his V2 rocket technology was behind the German Blitzkrieg and the Blitz of London, things like that. So during Operation Paperclip, the US smuggled Werner von Braun out of Germany, installed him to the head of the space program, and used his rocket technology to power America to the moon. And so it was his rocket that was really behind, was one of the precursors to the technology that led America to the moon. But despite the fact that Werner von Braun was the father of moon exploration, he actually is proof that the world was flat. And the proof is on his gravestone, because when he died, his gravestone reads, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." So we've got here the references to God, which is very playing into the flat Earth belief, inherent Christianity, but also this idea of the firmament showeth his handiwork. The firmament is the name in the Bible for the roof on top of the world. So according to Mark Sargent, this is evidence of the flat Earth, because why would the father of rocket science explain on his gravestone that there's a roof on top of the world? The only explanation Mark Sargent can think of is that this is a post-deathbed confessional. This is von Braun saying, I had to say those things. I had to join in with the lie to get out of Germany. But truly, there is no moon landing because you can't get to space because there's a roof on top of the world. Now, I would argue there's another interpretation of this particular gravestone epitaph. And I think that interpretation is this whole bit about the heavens declaring the glory of God for the guy who saw himself as his technology having the key to the heavens. We only got there because of me, so isn't it glorious? So it's one of those two, and I'd argue it's very clearly the latter of those. Once you have a dome on top of the world, it starts to ask questions about the rest of the solar system. So ask Mark about the rest of the solar system. He said the planets aren't real. He said the sun and moon are real. They're light sources outside the world, but they're nowhere near as far away as we think. But none of the planets are real. None of the stars are real. They're just paintings on the dome or projections onto the dome, like you're in a planetarium. I actually asked Mark, I wanted to get to the bottom of his conspiracy theory belief, and especially this patchwork of conspiracy theories, especially the ones that disagree with one another. So I asked Mark, did you ever come across a conspiracy theory that you used to believe in, but you now recognize cannot possibly be true and is nonsense? And he said, you know what? I did. He said, it's interesting because he said, I used to wonder why were all these different conspiracy theories true? And then I realized that the flat earth made it all make sense. Because I thought, why did they kill JFK? Well, they killed JFK because they knew they couldn't actually get to the moon. They'd have to fake it because you can't get to the moon because the world is flat. So once he found the flat earth, it was like the Rosetta Stone of conspiracies. It's a thing that united them and make them all make sense. But he said, there's one thing that doesn't make sense, and I no longer believe it. In fact, I want to find the guy who came up with it and debate him because I want to know who put him up to it. He said, I no longer believe there was ever a civilization on Mars. And I said, yeah, but that's because you no longer believe in Mars. That's because you don't think the planet's real. That's not what I was asking about. Did you believe in a conspiracy that's no longer true? You've left that conspiracy because you've gone further rather than come back to reality. But that's Mark Sargent's version of the world. This is an image taken from his website, The Enclosed World. I don't think he thinks that's literally what the world looks like, but that's an illustration he's happy to use of what the world looks like. And so these YouTube videos were immensely influential and were driving people through YouTube's algorithm and its insistence on recommending you nonsense to keep you watching. The only thing YouTube cares about is that you're watching YouTube. It doesn't care what you're watching. So if you're looking at videos of space and they can push you a 3-hour conspiracy theory video about how the moon landing was fake because the world is flat and space isn't real, then it'll do that, especially if some people have watched it, because some people will watch that video because they're interested. Others will watch it because they think it's hilarious and ridiculous. Others will watch it because they want to understand what conspiracy theorists think. Others will want to watch it 10 times because they're doing a point-by-point takedown for their skeptical blog. All YouTube sees is one big audience. It doesn't see 5 small audiences or 4 small audiences. So YouTube thinks this is a really popular video. I'm going to recommend this to loads more people now. And the whole thing started to spiral. And that's how the Flat Earth movement grew, by YouTube pushing Flat Earth videos at people, whether or not they were already flat earthers, whether they believed in other conspiracy theories or not, just trying to find people who would watch the video to the end in order to get YouTube the advertising revenue that it was after. And so the effect of that meant that it actually spilled out onto the streets. So in Chester, not far from where I live, there was a chap who was regularly talking about the flat earth on the streets and taking his speaker and microphone and proclaiming the gospel of flat earth there. And I actually went along to his local flat earth meeting in the pub, because if you're someone like me and you find out that there is a regular meeting in the pub of flat earth believers, of course you go along to that meeting. Of course you share a drink with people who believe the world is flat. Again, not to tell them how wrong they are, not to feel superior to them, but just to try and understand what brings people together around the flat earth and how do they support that belief. I had lots and lots of really interesting things. I was told, don't trust anything you've not discovered or demonstrated for yourself. So you can't trust a demonstration you didn't do, any scientific experiment that you haven't personally done. Ignore it because you can't trust it. It's a very convenient way of getting rid of anything that proves the world is actually round. Anything to do with telemetry, anything to do with satellite navigation, anything like that. I didn't put a satellite in space, therefore I can't repeat the experiment myself. Therefore, I should ignore any sat-nav data. They also told me photos are not reliable evidence, because photos can be photoshopped, they can be fake, they can be digitally manipulated. You don't know what's outside the frame. You don't know what's happened to that photograph between it being taken, being shown to you. So you can never, ever trust photographs. They are inherently unreliable, whereas YouTube videos are incredibly reliable. Here's 5 different YouTube videos that prove that the world is flat. In fact, I was shown, here are 5 different YouTube videos of experiments that demonstrate the world is flat. And when I asked, the people showing me the video had not carried out those experiments themselves. And that I think is really interesting. Those 2 mantras of don't trust experiments you've not done and don't trust digital media, it can be manipulated. Both those mantras get jettisoned when it comes to presenting evidence they agreed with. And this, I think, is key, not just because it explains a lot of what's going on with the flat earth world, but also explains a lot of what's going on in all sorts of alternative beliefs, and also what we're doing. Because the majority of the time, the evidence that you question isn't the stuff that agrees with you, it's the stuff that disagrees with you. We give evidence that agrees with our preconceived notions a complete pass so much more of the time than we do for anything that disagrees with us. Whereas when we come across something that we disagree with, we spend time scrutinizing it to find out why it's wrong. We don't do that with stuff that we actually agree with. And that, I think, is the flat earth movement, just illustrating that writ large. It's what happens when that instinct gets out of control. It's not just in Chester, in the local pub. There was actually a flat earth convention in the UK, 160 people for 3 full days in a hotel in Birmingham talking about why the world was flat. Obviously, I went to that as well. Obviously, I spent 3 days in the presence of hundreds of flat earthers. One of the greatest weekends of my life, one of the most fascinating weekends of my life. And something that taught me a lot, I think, about not just the flat earth conspiracy, but conspiracy theories more generally. And I want to share with you some of the things that I saw there. So the first speaker, or one of the first speakers that I saw, it was a chap called Iru Landucci. Now, Landucci is an Argentinian YouTuber and conspiracy theorist. He believes that the New World Order is in charge of the world, that 9/11 was an inside job, GMOs are evil, vaccines are evil, fluoride is evil. And he came out as a flat earther in 2014. And here he is on Argentinian television talking about Tierra Plana, the flat earth. Iru had come all the way from Argentina to the UK for this talk. And it was there was a couple of things that were interesting. One was that he was introduced by the conference organizer with an anecdote about how there was a mix-up as to when his flight was arriving, because Iru arrived 24 hours earlier than anyone was expecting. And the organizer was explaining that they had to drop everything and run to the airport to go and collect him, and what a hilarious mix-up this was. And they talked about it like it's just one of those things that happens. But I thought, yeah, I bet that happens all the time when your worldview can't account for the international dateline. Like, I bet that kind of mix-up is going to happen all the time when you can't explain why Argentina is a different day to the UK at any given point, or Australia is often a different day to the UK. The other thing that was really interesting was Iru misunderstood how long a speaking slot he had, and he turned up with a 3-hour presentation for a 1-hour speaking slot. That's something I'm occasionally guilty of, but I promise I won't do today. And so after negotiations with the organizer, they agreed that he'd give his talk in 2 parts. And so he gave the first half of his talk for an hour and a half on the Saturday morning, and he gave the second part of his talk for an hour on the Saturday afternoon. And then he gave the third part of his talk, the third half of his talk, on the Sunday morning for another hour and a half. And so Iru talked for a long time. But what was interesting was not a lot of it was about the flat earth. It was about all of the other things he believed. For example, he believed that we know for a fact that the UN is a front for the one world order. And the reason that we know that is if you look at the Spanish name of the UN is the ONU. It's like the Organization of Nations United, ONU in Spanish. If you read that backwards, that's UNO, which is Spanish for one. And therefore, that's proof that the UN is a front for the one world order. At this point, I was at the conference with Dr. Alice Howarth from the Merseyside Skeptics Society. She leant across to me and said, does he realize that UN is already French for one? Because he could have shortcut a lot of that wordplay if he just picked a different language. But this idea of linguistic symbolism is something that came up constantly, not just with Iru, but with other speakers there as well, looking for anything he can make as a connection. And once he manages to make any kind of connection, well, that must be the connection that was intentional. He said, if you look at dinosaurs, we know for a fact that those aren't real. They look ridiculous. They look like a mix between alligators and rhinos and giraffes. And that's because they were invented by an artist who was paid by the New World Order to pretend dinosaurs ever existed. And the artist drew on those existing animals as their inspiration. This, I think, is creationism. This is just the creationist roots of flat earth coming out again. How do you explain dinosaur fossils and the evidence we have of dinosaurs if the world is only 6,000 years old? Well, it was all invented and placed there by the New World Order and invented by an artist. Speaking of which, he said that atheists might think they're not worshipping any gods, but actually atheist comes from the Greek word athos, which was a mountain god, and therefore atheists are all secretly worshipping mountain gods, even so secret that they don't realize it themselves. This kind of wordplay just came up time and again. But there was another point in Iru's talk that actually caused me to pause and draw breath. And that's when he said, if we want to know what the intentions are for the people who rule the world, all we need to do is look to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And that proves who's in control of the world and what they intend. And this actually, I've got to admit, shocked me because the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a well-known, thoroughly debunked anti-Semitic hoax. It was propaganda. It was anti-Jewish propaganda put out in Russia, because obviously propaganda is going to come from Russia. Few things changed there. And it was put out. It was actually, I think, a plagiarism of a fiction about Machiavelli, the Italian politician in hell. It was like a satire written about Machiavelli in hell. And it was reworded and renamed as if this was a literal transcript of a meeting of the Jewish people who rule the world and how they're intentionally seeding diseases and pornography and wars and things to weaken the Western world, to weaken the entire world so that they can control it better. And I was not expecting such a thoroughly debunked anti-Semitic document that went on to influence, Hitler, went on to be spread by Henry Ford into America and influence white supremacy in the KKK movement in America. I wasn't expecting that to appear at the Flat Earth Movement conference. But yet, if we remember what Mark Sargent was saying, the people who control Hollywood are the ones who are hiding the secret of the flat Earth. The people who control Hollywood often is a synonym for Jewish people as part of that conspiracy. So we see some anti-Semitic roots, unfortunately, in the flat Earth conspiracy, sort of hidden just out the corner of your eye a lot of the time. One of the other speakers was a chap called Dave Murphy. He was a really interesting chap. He's a former computer programmer and electrical engineer. He used to work on Wall Street. At the same time, he was also a volunteer fireman in September 2001. And he was a volunteer in New Jersey when 9/11 happened. He wasn't involved in the cleanup or operation or the rescue or anything like that, but he did know people who were. And he said, as a result, 4 years later, he became a 9/11 truther. And since then, he said he had what he describes as a midlife crisis, which has led them to live what he describes as an off-the-grid lifestyle. And part of that off-the-grid lifestyle involves believing in the flat earth, and part of it involves recommending drinking and washing in your own urine in order to cure all manner of different diseases. So he says on his website that urine reverses aging, it's helpful with AIDS, with cancer, with smallpox, and with more than 60 other conditions. And he lists all the different conditions on his website. And so this was Dave is actually one of the UK's most prominent flat earth proponents, and certainly was when I saw him at the conference. And so he said he first came to the flat Earth in 2016. This was after, he said, after seeing videos by Mark Sargent and Eric Dubay, but he said it's also because he'd been doing his own independent thinking and independent researching and curvature calculations and things. But he actually appeared on Macedonian television in 2016 for an hour, bringing forth many of his arguments to a completely unprepared host. So he was saying things that most of the points were identical to the points in Eric Dubay's 200 Proofs, for example. But for many of the people at the Flat Earth Conference, watching Dave's video was the thing that converted them to being a flat earther. And he was sort of a celebrity at that conference. And I think that's interesting because I'd argue many of Dave's ideas came from previous videos. So the videos of Eric Dubay and Mark Sargent on YouTube, he thinks he got them from other places. Maybe he did, but they certainly appeared there. So we have this kind of daisy chaining effect of the videos from Dubay and Sargent influencing other people who put out their own videos, who influence other people, who put out their own videos, who influence other people. And it becomes this kind of self-sustaining ecosystem of referrals, and it sounds like consensus, even if they're all essentially getting their claims from the same places initially, if you track it back early enough. The video that Dave Murphy put out was actually responded to by Neil deGrasse Tyson on his Star Talk series, and this is what Dave talked about in his Flat Earth talk at the conference. And I think this is worth looking at because I think it illustrates something that flat earthers are quite prone to do. So Dave said this is one of the diagrams and illustrations that Neil deGrasse Tyson used in Star Talk to illustrate how Eratosthenes, an ancient mathematician, could demonstrate that the world was actually round. So Eratosthenes had two wells. When the sun was directly above one of the wells, you could see to the very bottom, but a well a little distance away, you couldn't see directly to the bottom. And this, Eratosthenes reasoned, is only possible if the sun is very near and the world is flat, and it's the angle that causes the shadow, or if the sun is very, very far away, very big, but the earth is curved, and it's the curvature of the earth that casts the shadow. And in Star Talk, they point out that when you have two wells, it's impossible to tell which version of those worlds, which version of that sun, that model is correct. But when you add a third well, you get access to other angles that allow you to resolve the question and figure out exactly what's going on with the world. And when you add a third well, you see it only works when the world is curved and the sun is far away. It doesn't work with a flat earth. And this is the video that Dave shared during his flat earth talk before debunking this video and pointing out how this video is an intentional lie from Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he said, first of all, he said, for this experiment, he said Star Talk added a third well to make the experiment clearer. So Dave points out that means that Star Talk didn't have a third well. Eratosthenes didn't have a third well. Therefore, the experiment is a lie. Because if Eratosthenes didn't have a third well, then he couldn't have done this experiment. So throwing out the video based on a line from the video without really engaging with what point was being made. Because sure, Eratosthenes may not have had a third well, but there have been other wells. Other wells have subsequently existed. Does the experiment work with three wells? Is the point true, even if the story around it isn't true? But because there wasn't a third well owned by Eratosthenes, we can ignore this entire point, according to Dave Murphy and the audience. The other thing he pointed out was, he said, I was looking at this video, this illustration from Star Talk a lot. And this is put out by, as Dave Murphy pointed out, professional scientists, professional science communicators. And he said, I realized if you draw a line from Eratosthenes' real well, and then draw a line from the other real well, they intersect at a point, and logically that point must be the center of the earth. Now he said, if you look at the third well, the fake well, if we draw a line from that well, we reckon we can spot it doesn't intersect at the same point. Therefore, this diagram is a lie. And because this is done by professional science communicators, they would have known how to do this properly. Therefore, they're intentionally trying to lie to you and mislead you in order to push something forward that they know is fake. Now, you could say this diagram proves that the world is flat because that third well doesn't line up. Or you could say this is not a very technically accurate diagram. What would happen if I drew a technically accurate diagram and then engage with the argument based on that diagram? So rather than throwing it out on a dodgy diagram, we actually do the diagram properly and then figure it out. That's intellectual rigor, but it isn't what was being done at the Flat Earth Convention. People didn't seem to recognize that there were gaps in these slam dunk debunks, and people just accepting the first thing they could see to dismiss an idea and then taking that as fact. The last speaker I want to talk to you about is Darren Nesbitt. I've got another speaker, but I haven't got time to go into it because it would take a while to explain. But Darren Nesbitt was a really, really fascinating speaker at the convention. So again, he's someone who believed in all sorts of different conspiracy theories. 9/11 was an inside job. The Boston Marathon bombing was a false flag. All these different things. He said in 2014 he came across flat earther arguments, and he came out as a flat earther in 2015. And I interviewed him on Be Reasonable in 2018. I actually interviewed him again just a couple of months ago because between me talking to him in 2018 and now, he's become one of the UK's leading COVID deniers. So many of he publishes a newspaper which is a COVID denialist anti-vaccine newspaper called The Light, which has got an underground following. Many of the COVID protests here in the UK, Darren Nesbitt's been there singing his COVID protest songs and various other things. But Darren, I think, is a really interesting fella, because at the conference, the first thing he was saying to people was, I encourage you all to be your own authority. Don't just take something as true because someone says it's true. Just because someone's got an impressive CV or because someone's got a lot of fame, just because they're telling you something, check it for yourself, which I think is really interesting because I'd have said exactly the same thing, especially when Dave Murphy is up on stage as a celebrity in the Flat Earth movement, pointing out that we can dismiss demonstration of the curvature of the Earth because an ancient mathematician didn't have three wells. Be your own authority is really good advice. It's skeptical advice. And he also said, do your own evidence-based skeptical research, which is exactly what I would say to flat earthers too. So I thought these were really interesting mantras for Darren Nesbitt to be encouraging people to hold. And the other thing he did that was really interesting was he put up this list of what he described as the flat earth questions. These are questions that any flat earther should consider about themselves. And they were things like, do you find more and more that you struggle to communicate and struggle to build relationships with people who don't accept the truth of the flat earth? Do you find yourself thinking that most people's problems would go away if they just accepted the truth of the world being flat? Do you find more and more of your conversations naturally gravitate back to the flat earth, even if you weren't expecting it or intending them to? And you could see amongst the audience people saying yes to these questions, asking them of each other and nodding and smiling in recognition and laughing and pointing out that, yes, they were saying yes to all these questions. And then Darren pointed out that this list of 10 questions is the cult questionnaire, the questions you ask yourself to figure out whether you're in a cult or not. And if you're saying yes to lots of these questions, it could be a red flag that you are in a cult, which I thought was a fascinating thing for a flat earther to be doing, to get up on stage and saying, these are signs that the flat earth for you people may well be a cult. That he believed that about much of the flat earth movement. And yet he was still a flat earther because he got up and immediately started debunking the disk model of the world with very obvious ways to debunk it. So, for example, he's saying we know from observation that traveling around the equator of the Earth is the longest way to get from point A all the way around and back again. And traveling around the Arctic Circle and Antarctica are shorter. And yet, in this disk model, that couldn't possibly be true because the equator would be around halfway between the Arctic Circle and Antarctica. But going around Antarctica would clearly be the longest way to get from point A all the way around and back again because you're going around the circumference of the circle. So that can't possibly be true based on basic observations. He said, think about the stars. How is it possible for people in the northern hemisphere to see one set of stars that people in the southern hemisphere can't see? How is it possible for someone in one part of the southern hemisphere to see stars that are the same as someone else in a different part of the southern hemisphere? Australia and South America see the same stars that Europe don't see. How is that possible on this disk model where we're all on the same disk looking at the same sky? He said that clearly can't be possible. So he said, you're being lied to with this model. And the people lying to you are the ones who want to hide the real truth of the flat earth from you. Because they want to give you a model that is obviously false so somebody can talk you out of it. So Darren had his own model of the flat earth, which better met some of these criteria. So that showed that you could take the longest time traveling from east to west across the equator. His model of flat earth looks like this. It's the one that he proposed, this diamond model of the world. And although it looks a bit silly, this actually isn't bad, because clearly getting across from east to west near Antarctica is going to be pretty quick. Getting across near the Arctic Circle, also going to be pretty quick. The longest way is going to be across the equator, because that's the furthest point of the diamond. So there's some pretty good stuff there. Obviously, it has some flaws. There are some drawbacks to this model. So you might look to those edges and think, I wouldn't want to fall off one of those. But actually, that's only if you believe they are an edge, because according to Darren Nesbitt, they aren't edges. They're actually four-dimensional time-space warps. And so actually what happens if you did try and travel west is you wouldn't drop off the edge. You just pass through the four-dimensional time-space warp and reappear back from the east. in a kind of continuous travel, like a Pac-Man version of the world. You can just wacka, 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 wacka all day long and never fall off the edge. But that does at least fit better with observations than the disk model, where if you did travel in one direction long enough, travel north long enough, you'd hit a wall and have to come back. But I looked at this model and thought, I can improve this model even further, Darren, because if I just took this diamond model and just bent it back until the yellow bit met the yellow bit and the red bit met the red bit, what I'd have is a three-dimensional object, not unlike a sphere. And I think if you actually took more than 3 measurements, but took multiple measurements along the four-dimensional warp, and then found out where that matched up to the other side and mapped all that together, you'd iterate yourself back to a sphere. So I do hope that one day Darren will be able to get back to a sphere. And I hope he's got the intellectual honesty, the intellectual rigor to get there. I think at least he's asking more deeper questions than many of the flat earthers, even if these days he's fully off on the COVID is a hoax, there is no virus train right now. I'm going to have to skip over one model. I may come back to it in the Q&A if people are interested, but there was a model of the world that posited that the world was a giant egg. I'll come back to that later if people are interested. But to summarize, how do we know what isn't true? How do we know that these aren't true? Well, let's take a look at some of those flat earth proofs and see how they line up to reality. So let's take, for example, the horizon looks flat. You know, one of the most popular gut level arguments for the flat earth. It's the one that every flat earther brings out at some point. This image is actually taken from one of their own memes. This is an image titled "Show Me the Curve," saying there is no curve on this picture. You can't see a curve. It's very clearly flat. But even in this image, this is their own proof. If we apply a ruler to it, we can see it isn't flat. While the ruler touches at the center, it doesn't touch at the very edge. Now, that may well be because of the landscape they've chosen, but even their best evidence for the world being flat, I can apply a ruler and demonstrate that there's a curvature or at least a not total level thing in their own image. It's just that the eye isn't built for being able to see the subtleties of the curvature. And that's because the world is massive. The world is so much bigger than we can really comprehend in our brains. It's 24,901 miles in circumference. Call it 25,000 miles. We never see, very few of us ever have the privilege of seeing all 25,000 miles in one go. So we never get to see that. And few of us ever get to see that much of the curve. And few of us even get to see that much of the curve. And this is still way more the curve than any of us will normally see in our everyday lives. And yet, even by just zooming into that circle that I started with a few times, it looks a lot flatter than the original circle would ever have you believe. And that's just zooming into a circle created in PowerPoint. Our brains aren't built to look at a very subtle curve and say, that's curved. It's just too curved for me to be able to detect with the naked eye. Because we didn't evolve to deal with things at the size and scale of the Earth. We evolve for things that are in our everyday lives, trees and bushes and animals and things. What's nearby? How close can we get to one another and to the thing nearby? We didn't evolve to be able to handle 25,000 miles in one go. It's why we aren't built to, why we don't process numbers very well. What about this idea of cannonballs and helicopters and airborne objects on a spinning world? Again, this is something we just didn't evolve to be able to hold in our head. That the real physics of the world are so counterintuitive. When it comes to firing that cannonball, the reason it doesn't shoot off at 1,000 miles an hour to the side is because when the cannonball leaves the cannon, it is already traveling at 1,000 miles an hour in the same direction as the Earth through air and an atmosphere that's also traveling at 1,000 miles an hour. So relative to what's going on around it, it can travel in a straight line because everything is spinning. And that feels strange. This idea that the force exerted on things that move through the air, that they're still influenced by the force exerted by the Earth's spin. That's counterintuitive. And I've got a really good demonstration of how counterintuitive it is. And it's these people being pulled on these people on a trampoline being pulled by a tractor at 20 miles an hour. And so the chap in the middle is going to jump up and down this trampoline really, really high as the tractor pulls the trampoline at 20 miles an hour. But it starts off with the trampoline moving at 20 miles an hour, and it'll continue that constant movement. And your instinct is, when he lifts off the trampoline, he's going to splat against the back wall at 20 miles an hour, or he's going to lift up and the trampoline's going to move and he's going to drop straight on the ground. That's what you think is going to happen. That's what feels naturally true. But what actually happens is the guy travels in a parabolic arc 20 miles an hour forward, because when he set off, he was going forwards at 20 miles an hour. And so he's able to land back on the trampoline and bounce safely. That doesn't feel true. But to understand what the world is actually like, we have to engage first with the physics of the real world, however counterintuitive. And if we're going to dismiss them based on the physics of the real world, not based on your gut level understanding of what ought to happen, because we can quite often be wrong because the world is so counterintuitive in lots of ways. And speaking of which, what about this idea of water? Flat Earth, at the Flat Earth conference on the right there is a guy pouring a glass of water over his head to demonstrate that the world can't possibly be round, because if it was, all the water would just run off the same way it runs off his head when he pours a glass of water over his head. The chap on the other side is doing the same thing with the lemon, perhaps slightly more sensible than on camera to the national media, just dousing yourself in a glass of water to try and illustrate a point. But they always make this point about water. It always finds its level. It never ever bends. It can't curve around a sphere, anything like that. And this, again, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the counterintuitive physics of the real world. This is one of their memes about the behavior of water. And, it's saying that all rivers run to the sea. So in a globe Earth, when the river is running to the sea, it's going to have to go very clearly uphill. You can see these arrows are pointing that the direction of the water traveling is uphill, going upwards to the center of that curve. Whereas if we just flatten that image out, you can see the water is running downhill to a flat sea level. So that's one of their arguments. This is one of the memes, I think, from possibly from 200 proofs, but certainly from one of the flat Earth memes that I've seen. And this was shared thousands and thousands of times. But what this is doing is misunderstanding what gravity is actually doing, because this is assuming that what gravity does is pull down, because that's our experience of gravity at a local level. Anytime you're really going to deal with gravity, it's going to be pulling stuff down. But gravity isn't pulling stuff down. It's pulling stuff towards the center of gravity. So if we assume this gravity pulls down model, these three arrows point that at the center point of the curve, yes, it's going to be pulling down, but it assumes that also at the edges of the curve, it's also down is still straight down. Apply those arrows to their meme and they're right. That wouldn't be possible. The water would have to run uphill. But that isn't what gravity is doing. Gravity is pulling towards the center. The arrows are pointing towards the center of gravity. And if we take those gravitational arrows and apply them to their own meme, it becomes really obvious that at any given point, the water is running downhill. It's just that you've forgotten which direction down is, because we aren't built to contemplate the world and how the world works at an entirely global level, at the size and scale of the world. We evolved to contemplate it at a much more local level. And we can't apply our local thinking, our micro thinking, to a macro level and assume it's always going to be correct. And one of the other arguments that comes up all the time with flat earthers, as I've mentioned several times, is the earth is flat because Bible. This comes up all the time. It really surprised me, and in retrospect, it shouldn't, that so many of the flat earth speakers, the speakers of the Flat Earth Convention, would say that the flat earth was a proof of God. The flat earth was their connect. Once they found the flat earth, it connected them to the divine. They realized the creator was there. Or on the flip side, that the idea of a round earth is the tool of Satan, that NASA is satanic. And we know NASA is satanic because all the astronauts in pictures keep doing this, which is proof that they're Satan, not just that they're kind of nerds who still think this is cool. This idea of the globe Earth being satanic was completely suffused throughout the entire weekend and through so much of the flat Earth material. And I think this goes all the way back to Samuel Rowbotham, 1838, using the flat earth to disprove the Bible, to disprove Darwin, to disprove evolution. I think so many of those arguments were rooted in that kind of thinking, and they remain rooted in that kind of thinking, even if many of the proponents who end up becoming flat earthers didn't do so because they were religious. Some of them, I think, become religious because they became flat earthers, because it's so heavily influenced throughout the flat earth material. So just to conclude, what have I learned from the time I've spent hanging around with and talking to flat earthers and conspiracy theorists? Well, first of all, I learned it's not about science. It's really easy to say these people are science deniers. They don't understand the value of science. They don't appreciate science. And I don't think that's true. I think they really want to be scientific. They want to be able to do experiments that prove them right. They want to do it with the trappings of science. If they get any kind of science that they think is on their side, they will praise it to high heaven. So this isn't about rejecting science. I think this is much more about their identity and value set. I think this is about people who, first of all, the flat earth speaks to something about how they see themselves, how they see the world, what they value. And once they're prone to the flat earth for that reason, they'll backfill their belief with the science, because nobody wants to say the reason I think the world is flat is because it feels right. And the reason I think the world is flat is because I think Satan is behind loads of stuff. Nobody does that. So they all want the science to be there. So I think when we talk to them at a scientific level and think science is going to change their mind, I think we fundamentally miss the point of what made them flat earthers to begin with. I also think this is about rhetoric. It's about the inability to see through rhetoric. I think we do a very poor job of teaching people what makes for a persuasive argument, a cohesive argument, and a true argument, and the difference between those different things. I think part of it is the undervaluing of philosophy and history and various other humanities, where rhetoric is a much stronger force. And understanding how to pick through an argument that appeals to a gut level, I think, is fundamental to try and persuade people back out of conspiracy theory. It won't be done with just pointing to the science, because the science is there. They're just not listening to it because it doesn't fit their identity. It doesn't align with their values. YouTube has a massive role to play in recruiting people, had a massive role to play in recruiting people to Flat Earth. And I can talk about that in the Q&A. What happened after the Flat Earth movement, what happened after YouTube and Facebook started restricting Flat Earth content, and how that led to QAnon, and how that led to the COVID denialers and stuff that we're seeing. I think it's a straight line between many of these things. I learned there isn't one single flat earth belief. So some people believe that the world is a circle, that it's an infinite plane in all directions, that it's an enclosed world under a dome, that it's a diamond. There's the guy who thinks it's an egg. It isn't just one single belief. And so if we're going to talk to a flat earther, we first need to understand what they think, because there's no point us arguing about a circle version of the earth if they think the world is a diamond, because they're going to agree with us, and we're not going to be able to get to the heart of what their actual issues are. We need to first listen before we start to explain. We can't just go wading in with our truths. Otherwise, we'll be just like those people on the Flat Earth forum who assumed that they knew better than all the flat earthers because they had the right answer, and then because they had none of the working out, they'd lose the arguments. We need to listen first, and that's true of all conspiracy theories, I think. But also we need to understand that flat earth isn't one single belief. It isn't just that this person is a flat earther and that's that. Because along with being a flat earth, people might think that the Bible is literally true, that there's signs of Satan's influence in the world everywhere, that the Illuminati and New World Order are secretly behind all of world events, and that they may or may not be Jewish. They believe vaccines are evil, chemtrails are evil, flu rides evil, alternative medicine can cure cancer, but they don't want you to know. Flat Earth is a patchwork of conspiracy theory beliefs, and often it is just the most visible conspiracy theory belief that person believes in, but they come with lots of other beliefs. And I think what we then see is those people will move through different conspiracy theories, sometimes getting more and more extreme. I don't think I'm yet to meet a flat earther who believes the Holocaust happened as you or I would agree it happened. So one of the questions I always ask a flat earther when they come up to me in the Q&A before we get started into a flat earther, quick question: what do you think of the Holocaust? I'm yet to see a single flat earther say it happened like we can read about in the history books. So I think the flat earth is just the most visible of their beliefs. But if we think about them as just a flat earther, we miss the bigger picture, and therefore we miss our chance to try and really engage with what people actually think and why they think it. I think it's not about accepting the belief that the world is flat. I think it's about rejecting mainstream thought, rejecting what everyone else thinks. It's openness to a cluster of alternative ideas for whatever reason that those ideas might fit or scratch a psychological need that fit with an identity or value set that you have. I also think people come to the flat earth for lots and lots of different reasons. And some of those reasons are because they've had a traumatic experience. So there's people who got up at the flat earth convention who talk about how they were going through a really rough time in their lives and then they found the flat earth. Or things weren't going right for me and I didn't quite know where I was, or I lost all my friends, or I felt very isolated. I suddenly found myself alone. I went through a period of ill health. I lost someone very close to me. Something happened that interrupted their daily lives and how they see themselves in the world. And even if they've recovered from whatever that one traumatic event might have been at that moment, they don't realize that that event has just switched them onto a different train track. And now they're recovered, but they're going off in a different direction. They don't realize that the switch happened. You know, sometimes these kind of crises, these traumas, these mental health crises can have this effect on people. And I think we need to be sympathetic to that and understand that that might be what was going on when people started to believe in these conspiracy theories. I think isolating people further isn't going to help them. And it's why I always end by saying that when we want to try and help people, and the reason I'm involved in skepticism, the reason I'm a skeptical investigator and an activist, is because I do want to help people. I think it's kind of part of our social contract. The good that we do for the world isn't helping people. I think if we want to help the people who believe in these things, we don't achieve that by mockery. I think we achieve it through understanding, through listening, through showing people that that we still recognize that they're human, even if they have some pretty unusual ideas, pretty abhorrent ideas even. Recognizing the humanity in people is the first step in leaving them away from being isolated and bringing them back to a community. And so I think that's one of the things that's incumbent on us if we actually want to make the world better and lower the amount of conspiracism in the world, is to actually listen to people and talk to people and not just mock them and write them off. I hope you've enjoyed that. I look forward to the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer anything at all, as long as you're all still there, because I've been talking to myself for the best part of an hour. But thank you so much, everyone.
Wow, thank you very much, Marsh. What a fascinating talk. And look, you'll be delighted to know that trampoline tractor jumping is in the next Olympic Games in Brisbane, Australia. I thought that's a terrific. We've had in all the time that we've been doing this, because of COVID, last couple of years, I don't think we've had so many questions. So everybody watching, I'm sorry I can't get to all the questions, but it's great to see so many questions up there. A couple of points from me before we get into the questions. I really agree with your point of view, where if you try to argue against anyone from the conspiracy mindset, unprepared, it's a fool's errand. You'll soon get yourself undone, and you won't win that argument.
Yeah, it's very easy for us as skeptics to sort of train ourselves to thinking that because we're used to being right on some things, because we know homeopathy is nonsense. Well, yeah. I was right about that. I'm just right about stuff. So I am a skeptic. Point me at something to be right about.
That's right.
Give me something to be right about. We need to do the homework. We need to actually understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I've learned that lesson myself. It's true. You get into skepticism, and everything seems to be right. You're right again. You keep being right. You think, that's it. Bring me the opponent. I'll just demolish them. And then you get egg all over your face. All right, let's have a look at some of the questions. Here's a question that's come in. How do the flat earthers explain time zones?
Yeah, so I think a question about the question always comes up: how do flat earthers explain X? And I always have to answer by saying, well, it depends on which flat earther you mean, and what type of flat earther. Because I think someone like Darren Nesbitt with his diamond Earth would still accept the transit of the sun, and so we'll still allow for that. Others will say because the sun is very near and very small, so that allows for it to be dark in Australia when it's light here in the UK, and therefore that we have to put in time zones to factor that in to deal with that, because they say you've got a massive round disc, massive disc of an Earth, a circle of an Earth, and if the sun is very small and very nearby, then it's not powerful enough to light up Australia while it's over Europe, and it's not powerful enough to light up Europe while it's over Australia. And time zones are just our way of coping with the different times of darkness.
Yeah, makes perfect sense to me. Okay, I think you might have answered this question sort of. The next question here is, are there any direct dangerous side effects or impacts from flat Earth belief? For example, anti-vaccine has obvious direct dangers for impact on people. So is there a direct negativity here?
So I don't think it's a direct negative aspect to it, but I think there's a whole lot of indirect stuff. So I remember when I was at the Flat Earth Convention, there were lots of different journalists there, and I was there, writing for a couple of publications, but I was undercover because I wanted to have conversations with flat earthers that were authentic and not just, I'm a journalist, tell me what you want a journalist to write about. It changes the flavor of conversation when people know you're there on a journalistic mission kind of thing. And so I was talking to lots of journalists. There was one journalist who was very happily wandering around thinking, oh, isn't this brilliant? There's a mad guy over there who poured water over his head. Isn't this such a laugh? And I said, look, you can report it that way. But if you really want to understand what's going on, you see that couple over there with the baby? Ask them if the kid's vaccinated. Ask them what would happen if their kid took really ill tomorrow. Would they go to the hospital to get some of that big pharma medicine they were saying was toxin? Or would they do something else? And I think that's where some of the harm is. I think other parts of the harm is I showed you glimpses of the anti-Semitism that's behind it. I think the problem is once people start to accept the flat Earth conspiracy theory, they have to accept a they who is hiding the truth from us. And once you accept that, there's a huge amount of material and a huge amount of conspiracy theory law that will point you to, that will fill in who the they are and put an ethnicity and a race and a scapegoat and a target on those people. And I think that is a real problem. And I think we see that as it moves into the anti-vaccine movement. I think, as I said, there's a straight line, I think, from flat earther to QAnon to the COVID anti-vaxxers. I think it's almost an overlapping Venn diagram. And we see that kind of paranoia about ethnic and religious groups being in control of the world and what we should therefore do to them. I think it all sort of fits. Once we kind of say, well, that person's a flat earther, but that's just kooky and silly, we'll just leave them to it. We sort of intellectually ghettoize them in a way that leads them to just associate with other people with far more abhorrent and dangerous views and end up being really radicalized into those views.
Have you ever had the opportunity then to put that argument, that point of view, which you've just expressed to us, to a flat earther?
It's tricky. I think, have I done that? I think when flat earthers turn up to my talk and ask about the Holocaust, and I ask them about the Holocaust and things, because what happens is they'll come up to me at the end of the talk and say, I've got some questions for you. And I said, great, I'll answer any questions you like, but just a quick one to you first. Yeah. Do you think the Holocaust, what do you think of the Holocaust? And when they say, oh, it's not like you explain, like the history books believe, which is what almost all of them have said, I always got to point out, isn't it interesting then that you believe the world is flat, which is quite a specific conspiracy theory, but you also believe the Holocaust is faked, which is a different, entirely separate area. What do you think ties those two together? And then they start to try to piece together or start to explain why this is one cohesive worldview. It's very hard to find people who are so early in the flat earth belief that they'd be open to having a conversation about where it can go in terms of the harms. And even if you do it, weirdly, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. So, oh yeah, believe in the flat earth, yeah. Well, you'll be denying the Holocaust and saying the Jews are evil next day because they think, well, I don't think that, and they won't think that up until the point where they're just associating with people who do.
Interesting.
This is just to finish. That's why we shouldn't isolate and other people who have these conspiracy theory beliefs by mockery and things like that. We just leave them to other people who agree with them, and some of those other people who agree with them will have these other really dangerous views. And if the only people they can associate with and socialize with are the people who've got those views, they're faced with a choice of, well, I'm already isolated from the mainstream. Do I isolate myself from this group because I don't like these views, or do I just allow these views to pass and allow them to become normalized? And actually, maybe they've got a point on some of this stuff. I don't agree with all the worst of it, but maybe they've got a point on some of it. And before you know it, they're radicalized in those kind of ways. Wow. So the way we arrest that is by not othering them, I think.
All right. So as I said before, folks, we have so many questions. I simply can't get to them all, but thank you for watching, and thank you for asking so many really interesting questions. Let me see if I can choose another one. Here's one. How much, and you may have alluded to this before, but how much do the flat earthers fight amongst themselves? Say that those flat earthers are clearly wrong. Maybe they're being paid shills, but you flat earthers are correct, or this sort of thing.
Yeah, it sort of it changes. It depends really. So when I first came across flat earthers, there was a real disagreement, but it was a disagreement on the material claims. So there was this big schism of, no, it's an infinite plane. No, it's a disk. No, it's under a dome. Those kind of things were really big sort of schisms. And they'd spend as much time arguing with one another about their model as they would arguing with other people that the world is flat. But that really changed into the modern movement, where I think there is still a lot of accusations of being shills and things like that. But it typically is once they've ejected someone from the community. So at the conference I spoke conference that I visited, Mark Sargent was meant to be one of the speakers there, and he was announced as one of the speakers there. But in the weeks leading up to it, he had a disagreement with the organizers, which led them to not only disinvite him, but also claim he was never part of the flat earth community to begin with, and was always a paid shill, and alleged that he was an actor by the name of so-and-so, and just made him out like he was never a flat earther to begin with, even as the speakers would then get on stage at the conference and repeat his arguments on stage. The people who would say, oh, I got into this by watching Mark Sargent's videos, would have no problem also believing Mark Sargent was never a flat earther and was always a paid shill designed to undermine the movement.
Wow. That I can't help but making the analogy here recently of anti-mask wearers, anti-vaccination advocates who have been struck down with COVID, making impassioned pleas from their hospital bed as they're gasping for air that I was wrong, I'm so sorry, please get vaccinated. All the anti-vaxxers will turn on them and claim that they're shills and paid actors and what have you. It's a very interesting analogy there.
Yeah, I think that kind of infighting, I wonder if it's kind of almost the inevitable conclusion of a group, a community, a belief system anchored to nothing with an evidential basis. So anything could just float away at any given moment. Anything you say, if because there's no real core of truth to it, no real core of evidence to it, then anybody could go from being the celebrity person who's completely right to someone who's completely wrong in a moment, because there's no objective way of figuring out whether once you're in that movement, what they were saying was true or not, because what you're believing in is objectively false to begin with.
And I suppose in another aspect, they're always looking out for enemies in that way. Look, folks, I'm sorry, we'll do one more question. Again, thank you all for interesting and fascinating questions. I'm sure you've really enjoyed Michael's talk as much as I have. Here's a question. Do we have any good examples of these, quote, intellectual trolls, end quote, admitting that they really didn't believe in the flat earth?
No, I don't. And to be honest, I try not to overstate. I mean, I think maybe at times I do overstate how much the movement in 2013 was intellectual trolls. So I can't prove that they're intellectual trolls, but what I will say is it's difficult to distinguish them from trolls because of the way in which any argument put back, they would find a very unusual but quite in-depth dismissal of. And it feels a lot like someone who how best to describe this? The arguments they bring forward don't sound like the arguments that you would bring forward if you really believe them. It feels like the arguments that are designed to rhetorically bewilder the person you're speaking to. And so that's why I get the impression that they were trolls at that time. And I think the depth of physics involved in some of the arguments they put forward showed that you have to really understand physics to a certain degree. And I think that degree is likely to leave you persuaded the world is not flat, but armed with lots of interesting ways of bamboozling people if you want to muck about. I think some people, I remember seeing some forums where some people have said, yeah, I used to say some stuff to muck about, but I don't think there's anything I can point to where it's like, oh, here's conclusive proof that this person was just having it on.
This sort of arguments, I mean, we've seen this for years now with the creationists, with their famous gish galloping and all this sort of stuff, bamboozling their opponents. And you get yourself in a quagmire. You can easily get yourself undone, as we were discussing before. Well, Marsh, thank you very much. How can people check up on what you're doing online?
Yeah, so you can follow the stuff we're publishing at the Skeptic magazine here in the UK at skeptic.org.uk. You can follow Good Thinking Society for all the charity work I'm doing as a skeptical investigator. And you can find me on Twitter at Mr. M. Marsh. Folks,
visit those sites at your next convenience. And I really enjoy Marsh's work over many years. We've known each other for many years now. You were my stooge once at a QED, weren't you? Live on stage.
I was the person who was doing applied kinesiology with you.
Yes. What happy memories they were. And you bought 2 power bands off me afterwards. It was really great. Well, once again, Michael Marshall, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
And everybody else, thank you for watching. It's a pleasure to bring you another speaker. Please don't forget to tune into the Skeptic Zone podcast every week for your skeptical fix, as well as Michael's podcast, of course. And don't forget to register your interest for the Australian and New Zealand annual convention. Go to skepticon.org.au. Let us know you'd like to attend, and we'll soon be bringing you details about how we're going to do it, given the COVID restrictions. But for tonight, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.